Salibonani, Linjani, Makadini, hello good people. The name is Marvelous Tinego Chibagidi, and today we are at the Zimbabwe Alternative Mining Indaba Zami 2022. That's the hashtag we're going with. I'm joined with Mukasiri Sibanda.
Asante sana Tinevimbo.
I'm happy to be here. My name is Tinashe Matika. I am, primarily I was here to make submissions on the effects, particularly with respect to the negative inequalities of the extractive sector. In the case of Hwange, we had brought evidence on the socio-economic gaps, particularly.
May you please let us know what exactly is a just energy transition, because it sounds like a very big word. The words seem simple, but the term, I think we just need our audience to get an understanding in simpler terms of what we're talking about when we're talking about a just energy transition.
Yeah, so there are two things that I want to bring here, because they are normally conflated when they are discussed. We have a just energy transitioning. We also have climate change, and looking at these all two issues from a financing perspective. So when you look at climate change and linking it with financing, what we are simply doing is to say, let's have a decarbonized economy. When we talk about a decarbonized economy, it's the economy that does not rely on fossil fuel to power growth. As you know that it is the emission of carbon dioxide of greenhouses that has depleted the ozone layer, and which has led to, I think for the people to understand it better, the adverse climate and weather conditions are getting more severe and more frequent. You can talk about droughts, you can talk about flooding, and particularly those from Matika land can give a testimony to the devastating impact of Cyclone Idai as an example. As we speak right now, the 1/3 of Pakistan is submerged underwater. More than 50 million people, the entire population of Kenya that have been displaced, more than 1 million houses that have been destroyed. So just to understand the scale and impact, and why we are faced with frequent droughts, why we have diseases, pandemics also coming in, locusts destroying yields and so forth. So these are the whole things. But when you talk about just energy transitioning, again, you are now looking more at people-centered. Remember, when I said the climate financing aspect, I was speaking about the economy, decarbonization, but you are now looking at the impacts. How do you get to put at the forefront of the agenda the people living in poverty, the people that are the most vulnerable, your workers that stand to lose jobs. Those are in Hwange, for instance. If we move away from coal, they are going to lose out. And maybe for Zimbabwe, it might not make that huge sense, but for South Africa, in Mpumalanga, for instance, you've got over 200,000 workers employed in the coal sector. But even so, for Zimbabwe, there is also value chains. The whole town of Hwange's life breathes around coal mining, as an example. But in the bigger scheme of things, we want also to understand that when slavery was abolished, I'm bringing it because it's an injustice, a developmental injustice. It is the slave owners who were compensated, not the slaves. Again, when colonialism was said to have ended, Zimbabwe, for instance, gained independence, you read closely and what's happening now, it is those that took our land that are even compensated from the money that Zimbabwe is having. That has got limited space for investing in health. So these are the issues that we say, how do you reskill the workers? How do you retrain them? How do you also provide alternative source of livelihoods for communities that are depending on these issues? But lastly, the point is about, for us, what is the baseline?
Climate finance refers to local, national, transnational financing, which may be drawn from public or private or alternative sources for the sole purpose of funding initiatives that target reducing the reducing of emissions and enhancing sinks of greenhouse gases.
How can we then go about this and ensure that this is the transition is just like the topic that we're discussing? How would we then decarbonize the economy and finance we talk about climate financing? How would we then go about it? And is this just? And what's the position of our country? Maybe if we could start there.
Yeah, to start with, I think the element of polluter pays principle is at the heart of environmental justice. It is a key developmental right that you can't mess around with the environment. You can't mess around with the planet. You can't mess around with people and get away with it. So we have economies that have grown, the so-called developed countries, at the expense of sabotaging the environment, at the expense of sabotaging the planet, at the expense of sabotaging the right of development of other people, particularly in the global south, Africa, Zimbabwe. I'm bringing this conversation for you to understand that we have our role is 0.05, I think, percent in terms of gas emissions. It's very negligible. For the lack of a better word, I wish I could find something.
For the lack of a better word, we can get away with it.
Oh, yeah. Yes. So, but in terms of the sheer size of impact, you understand, it's very disproportionate. This burden that we are bearing, it is not of our own making. So we should be talking ideally about reparations.
The need to finance, or rather to generate revenue for climate financing, is primarily to curb back the effects of climate change. And these effects of climate change, they mostly affect our human rights, access to water, access to a clean environment, access to clean air. And without the climate change financing agenda, we run the risk of exacerbated negative externalities. I will give you the example of Hwange. Hwange is a high economic zone. We have the centers of not only the nation's tourism, but we have mining, and we also have energy regeneration. But the challenge is when you reach there, the place is very hot. There's water challenges. It's on the verge of an ecosystem collapse. All these are the negative or the side effects rather of the extractivism, the parts that we don't see along the chain from sourcing to where it is being sold. So if we do not raise revenue to encourage the adaptation and the sustainable use, we run the risk of the ecosystem collapse, we run the risk of depleting the said resources, and we also run the risk of further impoverishing the areas with which we mine.
What, in your thoughts, what are the hindrances towards a just energy transition in the Zimbabwean context?
This is multi-layered. Multi-layered in the sense that the first layer, we are talking about domestic resource mobilization, our capability as a country, and the capability also in terms of failure to marshal the required resources to finance development. You see, when you talk about money, it does not matter whether it's money for climate financing, money for health, money for education. Once money goes into the government pot, you want it to be accountable. You want it to be, there should be transparency. Otherwise, the basic in terms of the principle of public financial management is maximization of public value. That is the idea. So if we are talking about climate change, it is too entangled with other developmental rights. Your right to food, for instance, your right to water, for instance, your right to life, you see, your right to shelter, because property can be destroyed and so forth. You understand? So you can't just entirely focus on climate finances and dislocate the whole conversation in terms of the principle of maximizing public value from whatever resources that we have.
I will be the broken record. I will keep going back to the policy. The policy is a function of human needs and the way with which we interact amongst each other. The policies in place do not allow for the upscript of grassroots influence, let alone involvement. And where the involvement is, it is merely a window dressing function. It is something that is lacking the qualitative aspect. We have seen consultants come and offer the promise of employment, the promise of so many things that were later not delivered by these extractive projects. The problem is always that the policy is not strong enough. The policy does not reflect our needs. The policy is not even centered around people-based development. So the challenge is let's redress the policy gaps. Government needs to sincerely commit towards an all-around stakeholder approach towards policy reform.
That is all we had for you. We are still at the Zimbabwe Alternative Mining Indaba, ZAMI 2022. Until we meet again, it's goodbye for now.